Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I am Betsy Hill, President of Brainware Learning Company, and I want to welcome you to our webinar on cognitive skills and second or other language acquisition. This is a re-recording of the original webinar because we experienced gaps in the audio during the live webinar. I have always been fascinated by language. I double majored in French and Russian in college, and I took every course that I could related to language. The philosophy of language, the psychology of language, linguistics. For the most part, it was folklore and hypothesis at the time. There was no real science, and certainly no neuroscience. Today, all that has changed. Here's our plan for our webinar. We're going to focus on cognitive skills and language, but we'll start with a little bit about how language operates in the brain. During our live webinar, we had a quick poll to get an idea of who the participants were. And this is a snippet of the poll results. 77% of the participants had English as a first language, but 9% did not have English as a first language, as some other language. 12% grew up bilingual, and three of the participants, 2%, grew up bilingual with English not being one of those. So we had representation from a variety of different types of interest in second language acquisition. As we talk about language, especially early language acquisition, I now think about my granddaughters, ages 3 and newborn in this picture. Charlotte is now 4 and extremely verbal, and we might tend to think that Emma has no language ability at the age that she was in this picture, but that would be wrong, as we will shortly see. This is from the work of Anne Fernald of Stanford, whom I had the pleasure of listening to for a full day in January. She became interested in motherese, that is, the different ways that she noticed that mothers, in this case German mothers, spoke to their infants. And she recorded adult-directed speech, baby-directed speech, and also speech produced by mothers who thought they were recording their voice for their babies to hear later. Here the x-axis is, actually it's the y-axis, is pitch or fundamental frequency, and the x-axis is the level of the mother's voice over time. And you can see in the very top sample that there is little variation in pitch, and the speech is quite continuous with few gaps, and those gaps are very short. It's much like I'm speaking to you now, a normal rate of speech of 200 words a minute. Then jump to the bottom, which is baby-directed speech. You can see the variation in pitch, sometimes 2 octaves, how the phrases are shorter, and how there are distinct pauses between them. We do talk to babies differently. If I had started this webinar with, "Hello, my friends, how are you today?" you would have thought I was nuts. But this is exactly the way we speak to babies. Why do we do this? Well, researchers believe that the higher pitch is due to the fact that babies prefer sounds that are higher in pitch, that the phrases are short with no pauses, or with pauses, so that it distinguishes a segment that has meaning, and also short because it needs to be short for babies to remember it. So we're already seeing the impact of memory on how our brains manage language. It turns out that the same patterns are common across many languages and cultures. And there is fascinating research that infants know more about language than we suspected. For example, there's research that shows that a different pattern in the crying of French and German babies actually reflects the tonality and the intonation of speech in each of those languages. The former, the French, tending to go up, and the latter tending to go down at the end. There's also research that shows a strong preference for the mother's voice at birth, since hearing has been going on in utero. Fernald's research has also shown how babies' language skills develop. The melodies of language, called prosody, were consistent across several cultures for different types of messages: approval, prohibition, comfort, and attention. At 12 months, babies are able to recognize the message in the melody. In fact, we can say that the melody is the message for babies at that age. In fact, if you have babies listen to approval messages or prohibition messages in other languages, they understand the melody. And at this age, if you deliver a prohibition message with approval prosody, so you're saying, no, no, don't do that, but you're saying with an approval, encouraging, go ahead and do that voice, like, what a bad girl, mommy does not approve. Or vice versa, babies get the approval message. They understand the tonality, they understand the prosody, but not the words necessarily at that point. By 24 months, however, babies respond to that mixed message by getting upset. And so if they hear a positive message, an approval message with a prohibition tone, they get very upset and confused. And it's clear that they are understanding both aspects of speech at that time. So these insights have prompted me to think about the role of prosody in learning another language after childhood. Of course, that is essential for tonal languages, but I wonder if we might be underutilizing the power of prosody in second or other language instruction for older students and adults. And by this, I don't mean that we should talk baby talk or talk with that motherese prosody. What I'm meaning is that by listening carefully to the melodies of language and the different melodies that tend to accompany different languages, we might actually be able to create stronger memory of language because we know, for example, that music and remembering something to music makes it much more memorable. So if we picked up and explicitly instructed on the music of the new language or the target language, we might have a better shot at that. And I'd be interested if anybody has explored that or has experience with that, what kinds of experiences and what kinds of results they've seen. So as we all know, children learn a first language just by being in it. Languages develop even in communities that don't have spoken language. And research has documented the general patterns of language acquisition, although there is, of course, tremendous variation. By 6 months in general, babies are familiar with the phonemes of the language or languages they hear around them, and particularly those that are spoken to them. And then they begin to prune the connections that represent sounds that aren't meaningful, that is, that don't pertain to the language in question or that don't pertain to anything relevant in their lives. At birth, our brains can learn any language, but of course, it gets harder later. One of the things that has contributed to the explosion of knowledge about how brains learn, of course, are brain scans, the ability to see what's going on in a brain while it's functioning. These are PET scans and show the areas of the brain that are most active during certain activities. The red and orange and yellow areas are most active, the blue and green areas less so. The white outline that is drawn here is just for reference. It just doesn't show up on the PET scan. And I also want to mention that this does not mean that those dark areas, that the ones that look black, that there's nothing going on there. In fact, it just means that they are less active. There is always something going on in all parts of our brains. The top left image is activity in the occipital lobe, the back of our head, where visual processing takes place. So when we're passively viewing words, that is the area of the brain that would be active. Listening to words, on the upper right-hand image, takes place in the temporal lobes, just above our ears. And you can see that speaking words is happening at the rear of the frontal lobes in the motor cortex. And the last image, the bottom right one, shows two highlighted areas, which represent what happens when we have to think about meaning and also be actively producing speech. So for example, this last image is when the subject of the research was asked to come up with a verb that would be associated with a given noun. So example, if they were given the word broom, they might say the verb sweep. This is a model of the brain where those two areas are highlighted. And as some of you may already know, they are called Wernicke's area. It's in the temporal lobe right along one of the ridges of the cortex. And this is the area where we store and manage our lexicon of words and objects. So when there's a problem, then we will have difficulty understanding spoken language. We don't know what the words mean. The front area, that little green colored area, is called Broca's area. And it's where we produce spoken and written language, where we manage syntax and language processing. If we have a problem or we have brain injury to this area, we will tend to have halting speech or disordered syntax, or just not be able to produce certain kinds of words. In 97% of humans, the major language functions are in the left hemisphere, but there are related functions that require the right hemisphere, especially with complex sentences and the integration of the emotional content and emotional meaning of words with the sound of the words themselves. And sometimes the brain actually uses the right hemisphere for a second language, especially if it is learned later. So it's happening in two different parts of the brain. Now, having said that Wernicke's area is where our lexicon is stored, recent work by neuroscientists at UC Berkeley created a map of meaning in the brain that shows a lot of common areas for all of us for certain themes. At least this is in American brains. I'm not sure what research has been done outside of the US and the American English language. And what they've shown is that words are stored and represented in their meaning all over the cortex. So while Wernicke's area is necessary to manage them and line them up and access them, there's actually a much broader representation across the whole brain. And it turns out that we store meaning in basically the same areas of the brain, regardless of the language and regardless of when we learn it. But the story is different when it comes to producing language. So when we're learning a new language, whether we're learning it as a child or whether we're learning it as an adult, Wernicke's area is going, and the same areas of Wernicke's area are going to be active regardless of which the language is. When we go to produce it, however, we have a different result, and bilingual and early language learners activate the same part of Broca's area for both of their languages. But older learners actually have to set up and activate a different area within Broca's. And that will certainly account for some of the difficulty of learning a second language. All of that provides some background to what we know about the difficulty of learning a second language, especially as we get older. And not surprising, given the developmental patterns we've been talking about, we are far better learning a language early if we want to speak it without an accent. So if we think about the differences between early and later language acquisition, pronunciation has a huge advantage in learning it earlier. Grammar, there is some advantage. Vocabulary, there is less advantage than in the other areas. And we'll talk about each of these. Oops. As we discussed earlier, some aspects of pronunciation start to develop in utero as the baby hears the sounds produced by the mother's voice and possibly daddy's voice and some others around it. But by 3 months, our brains have already started to reinforce some sounds and prune others for the sake of efficiency. So we talked about infants and their mother's voice. We talked about the cries of French and German babies. and the fact that scientists talk about a critical or sensitive period for the development of certain abilities, and pronunciation is certainly governed by that. There is less neuroplasticity as we get older in developing and learning the pronunciation and being able to replicate and reproduce it authentically. However, we also know that our brains are plastic throughout life, and there's some fascinating research. This, of course, is from my fair lady, Professor Higgins and Liza. But the example, the most recent research that I'm aware of comes from Japanese, where the sound L, ul, and the sound of the R, are not differentiated. So it is difficult for Japanese speakers to distinguish between the words road and load. But it turns out that using technology to elongate the sound helps them to hear the difference, and that the sounds can gradually then be shortened back to the pace of normal speaking, and they actually are able to hear the difference. They're trained to be able to distinguish between those two different phonemes, or English phonemes. I also think back to my own language classes in college when I took a full semester course on French pronunciation. And when I later traveled to Europe, I could pass myself off as Belgian, not French, perhaps because the Belgians tend to speak a bit more slowly, at least than Parisians. But in short, just because it is harder doesn't mean that a foreign accent can't be significantly modified. I can't recommend the methods of Professor Higgins for this, however. Direct instruction on the mechanics of articulation and practice with lots and lots of feedback are better than marbles and speeches about the nobility of the English or other language. Grammar is another vital part of language acquisition, and here the difficulty varies depending on the difference between the two languages. Again, the young have a distinct advantage. My 4-year-old granddaughter's speech is beautifully grammatical. Mistakes that she makes are most likely to be over-regularization. So she might say taked for took or taken, mouses for mice, although if she's talking about computer mice or mouses, then mouses might be acceptable. And some aspects of grammar are easier. So, for example, the role of nouns and verbs, which is essentially universal, is not going to be a problem. We will recognize the role of those in grammatical utterances. Other grammatical patterns depend on how similar or dissimilar the languages are. So examples of this are word order. So in English, we have the subject, verb, object order, or the adjective before the noun order. And when we're trying to learn a language that is consistent with that, it will be easier than if we have to rethink the order. Also, those that are less common will tend to be more aspects of grammar that are less common across languages, of course, will tend to be more challenging for more people. And here, inflection, so when we decline a noun in, fortunately, Latin prepared me a little bit for Russian when I started to learn that, because the ending of the word changes depending on the role it plays in the sentence. So all of these are going to make a second language easier or harder. During the live webinar, I was asked about Somali and Arabic, and have since done a little bit of looking into it. The Somali language is very complex and quite different in the ordering of words and the use of different kinds of endings, suffixes, and prefixes. So it would be, I think, one of the more difficult languages for English speakers to learn. Arabic often uses a common subject-verb-object order, but also can use the object-verb-subject order, as I understand it. So lots of variations, and it starts to explain why some languages are so challenging, depending on the language we started off learning. Here are just a few examples. English, German, Romance languages, I see the train. Subject, object, verb is something that is present in Japanese and in one archaic English expression, with this ring, I thee wed, as opposed to I wed thee. But that is very uncommon. Some languages, Gaelic is an example, have verb, subject, object, see I the train. And then inflected languages, of course, have no required order because the role of the word in the sentence is determined by some modulation of the word itself. So we can say canis morded hominem or hominem canis morded. It doesn't matter what word order we use because it's still about the dog biting the man, versus canem morded homo, which is man bites dog, even though the word dog appears first and the word man appears last. Vocabulary is the area where there is the least advantage for early learners. And of course, as adults, we don't just inhale new vocabulary the way young children do, but it's still the case that we learn a lot of new vocabulary throughout our lives. We think about words like email, blog, and laptop, and maybe I'm certainly dating myself because my children grew up with some of these words. But nonetheless, we are all learning words. The phrases and abbreviations that we use in texting and all of those kinds of things challenge us to learn a lot of new vocabulary. And sometimes they even make it into the dictionary. Or we also tend to have to learn a lot of language that is specific to our particular field. So if you're a teacher, you will understand the expression SPED, ELL, Title I, RTI, now MTSS, multi-tiered system of support. And just about every field of endeavor, of course, has its jargon and has its technical terms, and we are able to learn those quite well as adults. So with that background, let's move on to our consideration of the relationship between cognitive skills and language learning. And what we're going to be exploring a little bit is the relationship and the effect that cognitive skills have on language learning, and in a similar vein, the effect that language learning has on cognitive ability. So this is a chart that we use to talk about cognitive skills. They're basically mental processes. These are some of the most basic things that our brains engage in. And down at the bottom, foundational cognitive skills include things like attention, visual processing, sequential processing, processing speed, visualization, skills like that are about the basic ways that information comes into our brains and how we all hold on to it for a very brief amount of time. So if these skills are working well and then the information's coming in, that's great because that's what starts the learning process. And then on top of that are a group of cognitive skills that are now being referred to as executive functions. And I'm finding that most educators these days are familiar with the term executive functions. These are the directive capacities of our minds. And the core functions include working memory, that is our ability to hold information in our mind while we think about it and manipulate it. Inhibitory control, which is pretty much what it sounds like. It's our ability to keep ourselves from doing something we would otherwise do. The most obvious example would be refraining from punching somebody in the nose when they make us mad. But it also can refer to deferring gratification over a period of time, not just in that instant. And then cognitive flexibility is our ability to shift our mindset and use different faculties of our brains in different moments, and our ability to shift very fluently back and forth. On top of that are higher order executive functions. These read like a group of 21st century skills, or the list of skills that we want all of our students to get to in those higher order thinking of critical thinking, reasoning, problem solving, and all of that. And what we're showing here is that all of these sit underneath reading and math and everything else that we learn in school, because these are actually necessary for all of those processes. So just to take a little bit different look at the sort of stages of processing, and here is where we can start to focus on when we're taking in information. And here we're going to think particularly, of course, about language. So sight if we're reading, hearing if we're listening, potentially if we're doing sign language, touch might come into play there as well. And what happens is information comes in and resides very, very briefly in sensory memory. So we can't hold on to it very long because new information is always coming in. And here we screen out. We use our attention skills, for example, to screen out, and selective attention to determine which information we're going to move on to the next stage and actually try to hold on to. And that happens in working memory. That's when our brains decide that the information is important enough for us to actually focus on and think about, and then we become conscious of it. At either of these stages, if we don't rehearse it well enough in working memory, or if we don't decide it's important enough to move from sensory memory to working memory, all that information is going to just disappear. And of course, all of that is necessary to eventually get that information into long-term memory. So if we think a little bit about sensory memory, that cognitive process of holding on briefly to that information. So if we take in, let's say we hear someone talking about a dog, d, a, g, the 3 phonemes, and we hear them, and we're looking, and perhaps we're seeing a cute little dog, like in this picture here. And our ability to hold on to that and to associate it with the dog obviously is a key aspect of language learning. If we're trying to learn unfamiliar phonemes or an unfamiliar word, we may have to revisit that sensory information. And so our ability to hold on to that is quite important. When it comes to long-term memory, our ability to learn irregular verbs becomes part of that. And actually, regular verbs and irregular verbs, but it's a little bit different part of long-term memory that we use to actually learn them. So the pattern that is adding an ed to the end of a word for the past tense is something that becomes so automatic that it's simply in procedural memory. When we initially then, we've learned that rule, and the syntax tells us we just add d to the end of walked, or d to the end of try for tried, although the spelling, of course, will be different, but that sound will pertain in most of the situations until we get to those wonderful irregular verbs. When we can't say goed anymore, we have to learn the word went. And we will learn that by practice and remembering and being reminded, perhaps occasionally, before that too will become automatic. And we have to actually suppress our repeated experience with regular verbs in order to learn the pattern of those irregular verbs. Another skill that we can talk a little bit about here that plays a really important role, especially in learning another language. Plays a big role in everything we do, but becomes quite important in learning a new language, is working memory. So if we think about the sentence, John made fun of the girl who was kissed by the chimpanzee yesterday, we've got quite a bit of information going on there. So our ability to visualize that, which is it's a pretty odd sentence, but nonetheless, we are able to hold on to it and keep in mind and think about the relationship of all of these different entities, John, the girl, the chimpanzee, when things happened and what's actually going on. But now imagine that you can't remember what the words make fun of and chimpanzee mean. Make fun of course, is an idiom. It's not about making fun and actually having a fun time necessarily, but of course, spoofing or teasing or something like that. And chimpanzee would be a word that might not be a common entry in our mental dictionary when we're first learning a language. So that you have to keep those in mind and try to figure out what they mean. You may be able to do that by context, or you may have to ask and then plug that back in and hopefully still create that sense of all of the relationships, hold on to that, all that information. Now, let's pretend we're learning an inflected language where the word order permits the girl John made fun of was by the chimpanzee kissed yesterday. And you can really appreciate how important working memory is, especially in those early stages before the endings and the word order are something that we can rethink automatically, and that just makes sense to us. When we're having to juggle that and remember the relationships among those words, of course, it gets pretty challenging, a lot to hold in working memory. Another skill, selective attention, is quite important for inhibiting word candidates. To some degree, this happens within our native language because we can use different words to refer to the same object in many cases. But it also gets much even more complicated than that when it comes to a dual language speaker. So for example, this picture of a chair could be silla or asiento in Spanish, or chair or seat in English. And we have to actually suppress both the alternative English word as well as the Spanish word if we're a Spanish speaker trying to choose the right word to say in English. And all of this has to happen quite automatically and at a very, very quick pace in order to be able to speak as fluently as a native speaker. And it's why we hesitate often when we have to produce the correct word in another language. So one of the things that we know from recent research is that there is a strong relationship between learning a new language and our cognitive ability. There are actually a lot of benefits from second language learning. These include better attention, better working memory, all of these skills we've just been talking about, better inhibitory control, better cognitive flexibility, and in sort of the higher order concept formation, classification skills, analogical reasoning, storytelling. So it's wonderful that we can get all of these benefits from learning a second language. And there are really no negatives. The one negative, I guess, is that there's some evidence that if you learn two languages bilingually, you will have probably a slightly smaller vocabulary in each language, but of course, you have all the richness of all the language that you have learned. There are a lot of myths regarding bilingualism, and these are indeed myths. There is no cerebral confusion. Your brain knows how to keep track of these things and produce speech. It does not cause a split personality. Our brains can handle just about as many languages as we throw at them, especially when we're learning early. We learn language as language. And if there are different rules or different aspects of it, our brains will do that. If we're learning them both, one language doesn't outbalance the other. We can learn two languages or three languages even very readily as children. The languages aren't completely isolated in different parts of the brain. Of course, as we talked about, there is a difference where the speech is produced for later learners. But if you're learning, if you're truly bilingual and learning both languages from an early stage, then the languages are going to be in exactly the same parts of the brain. And you don't have to learn all skills twice. As we saw, there are certain aspects of language that we can carry over from one to the next. The roles of nouns and verbs are great examples. And if we have learned to speak grammatically in one language, then if it applies to the other, that's great. And if not, we will simply learn the other grammar as well. So as we saw in the poll, a lot of what we were focused on in this country, and the folks who I believe are participating in this webinar are doing it because of they're involved in English language learning. There are 60 million people in the US who do not speak English at home. Almost 5 million public school students are ELL. They speak hundreds of different languages. ELL students now account for more than 10% of the school population in Washington, D.C., Alaska, Colorado, Texas, Illinois, where I'm currently sitting, and Florida. And of course, parts of those states are going to have an even higher percentage. In some states, California being one of them, have even higher percentages of this population speaking another language. And if 22% overall in California, and of course there are going to be portions of California where the percentage is even higher than that, and even 17% in Nevada. It's complicated because when we're talking about learning English as a second language or as a third language or another language, we also have to deal with the fact that young ELLs are more likely than other children to be living in poverty. We know that poverty tends to have some pretty significant effects on cognitive development, although that can be changed later because of the plasticity of the brain, but also on language. And as we saw the interplay, and we're going to continue to see that between cognitive skills and language learning, that's going to have an impact. And then there's, of course, that portion of ELL students that also have a learning disability. I think the average percentage of students in special education nationwide is about 13%. And English language learners are also going to be having a certain percentage, of course, of their population that also has a learning disability, and that's going to complicate things. I also saw that just 20%, 1 in 5 students in the US is enrolled in a class to learn a second language. I find that sort of sad. With all the benefits of second language learning, it would be such a benefit to our students if we really understood that this ability to speak multiple languages is something that could help us across the board. We also know, and this is not a surprise probably to anybody who's listening to this, that English language learners on average perform significantly less well than their non-ELL counterparts, whether it's reading or whether it's math. This is from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and it's been pretty consistent for many, many years. We keep hoping that it will start to change, and perhaps there are some things that we're now learning, particularly about the role of cognitive skills in language learning, as well as other aspects of language learning that will help. So that's actually what I want to talk about next. So we talked a little bit about the benefits of language learning for cognitive skills. Now we want to turn it around, and we're going to talk about the importance of cognitive skills in language learning, particularly things like working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. And what we're going to do is take some examples. I'm going to take you on a little tour of a number of different groups that we have worked with in doing cognitive training, and to look at the impact on, not directly on language, because that's been a little bit harder to get at, but in the impact on reading and math and other academics, which are, of course, mediated by language. So the first one is a Chinese community center outside of Chicago in the western suburbs. For these children, the Chinese is the primary language spoken at home, and their parents want them to continue to be able to speak Chinese. So they've entered them in after-school programs that includes Chinese school as well as other kinds of enrichment. And these students use Brainware Safari cognitive training software at home with their parents for 12 weeks, 3 to 5 times a week, a total of about 4 hours a week. So 45-minute sessions, pretty much. And we use the Woodcock-Johnson Cognitive Battery and some tests of achievement as the pre-test and the post-test. So here you're seeing each of these. This is a small group of students, of course, but we're seeing for each student, you see the student number across the bottom. And on the y-axis, we're seeing their age in years. So when you take the Woodcock-Johnson or other types of cognitive tests, it compares your score to the national norm. And so it says, okay, you scored on this test like an average 8-year-old. Well, maybe you're 8 and you're performing exactly on par with what would be expected for an 8-year-old. But maybe you're only 6 and you're ahead of the game. Or maybe you're 10 and you are only functioning like an average 8-year-old in terms of your intellectual capacity, your cognitive capacity. So here we're seeing, and the light blue bar is the pre-test, the darker blue bar is the post-test, the age in years is designated in the data labels, and the red bar is their physical age. So you can see that on the pre-test, these students were performing pretty much at their age level, some of them a bit ahead. But all of them improved over the course of these 12 weeks. And in fact, an average improvement of 3 years and 6 months during that time frame. So this is a fairly affluent group of parents very committed to their children's education and to their language competency. But nonetheless, we are still seeing some pretty dramatic cognitive improvements. We also saw significant improvements across the board in their academic ability. And as you can see here, the average improvement in terms of academics, and this is reading fluency, math fluency, passage comprehension, so things that do require language, the math fluency not quite so much, but those other ones requiring quite a bit of language competency. And an average improvement of over 2 years, almost 2.5 years in those 12 weeks. Now I want to take you to a very different student population, very different area, into Hammond, Indiana, which is a very high poverty area of Indiana in general. And here we were able to work with a bilingual program that services a fairly large number of students with speaking many, many different languages and across a number of different schools. This particular study was conducted with with the students in an all-day bilingual program in students in 6th through 9th grade, so older learners. The others were elementary age. These are slightly older, of course, though they're still that adolescent age. Similarly, they used Brainware, but this time 4 times a week for a shorter period of time. It was an 8-week implementation. And the ways that we were able to look at the impact of cognitive training were through teacher surveys and through a district-mandated reading assessment, the Scholastic Reading Inventory. This is a very difficult test in English of reading for these students. There were a number of areas of growth, and the teachers in general commented on the great extent to which they saw cognitive growth across the board with their students. But particularly, every student they noticed was in their desire to perform and put in effort, so their confidence in learning, their ability to pay attention and focus and really concentrate on their activity, the ability to follow directions, which of course has quite a bit to do with language as well, and to visualize. And we talked about how some of these cognitive process, especially visualization, can be really important in language learning. Now, before they used brainware and did their cognitive training, their Lexile scores were measured between the first and the second trimester. So just business as usual and their typical language classes. And you can see that by the yellow line that these students, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th graders, are performing barely above basic on average. And you can see that some of them are quite low performing, not much going on that's proficient, a little bit in 7th and 8th and 9th grades. Now, after they use brainware, the trend starts to look a little bit different, even just in 8 weeks between the pre-test and the post-test, where they're now starting to separate from that basic line and starting to move incrementally up, even that particularly short period of time. We can also look at the percentage of students improving their scores. Because this is such a difficult test, many students don't. You can see the difference between the first and second trimesters and the second and third trimesters in terms of the percentage improving. So in the first trimester, the first testing that they did, the improvement was only evident in 42% of the students, so less than half. Whereas after they did cognitive training, 67%, 2/3 of the students actually improved their scores. And this was in 7th grade. The 8th and 9th graders, even more dramatic, where between the first and second trimesters, only 1/3 of the students improved, whereas 100% of them, all of them, improved their scores at the second trimester after their cognitive training. Teachers commented on the extent to which this was really a positive force in developing students' abilities and their potential academic improvements, as well as more effort and being more focused, a way to improve memory, visualizing, and strategizing. So that gives the students new tools. Of course, brainware is in a video game format, so the students experience it like a game, but it has a very serious purpose, and it's not just a bunch of games. It is based on serious clinical therapy and the kinds of exercises that are known and have been used for decades to strengthen cognitive abilities. Now we'll go to another population, still quite poor in this case, out in Fillmore, California. Rather than a city, though, it's a small city, but in a very much an agricultural area. Hispanics and Latinos are 75% of the population, so a good portion, at least half of the students in the district are English language learners. We were able to work with the 3rd grade classes in 4 elementary schools. In each school, there was one class that used brainware and one class that did not use brainware. At least during this time period, the other students who didn't use brainware were able to use it during the following semester. They used it 3 times a week for 12 weeks. And in this case, what we're going to look at is the impact on California state assessments. So now we're not looking immediately directly at that language ability, but how they can improve their performance on high stakes testing. We're going to look both at ELA and their math scores because we know that we need to have good language skills for both of them. And what we saw was a significant impact on in both areas. What we're looking at here is median scaled scores for the English language learners and the English fluent students. And you can see that there's a dramatic difference between the two groups, as would be typical and as we might anticipate. Now, interestingly, what you're seeing is the scores go down between 2012, when they were in 2nd grade, and 2013, when they were in 3rd grade. There's a mistake on that, but it's between between their second grade and their third grade scores after they used brainware or didn't use brainware, depending on whether they were in the control group or the study group. This is typical. Actually, the entire state, the scores went down in ELA. So what we're going to see here is that the group of students, whether they were English fluent or English language learners, went down less. Their scores decreased less on average if they had used brainware. They decreased more if they had not. We can also see that the English language learners actually decreased less than the English fluent learners. So there's something going on where we're actually being able to start to close that gap, narrow that gap between the English learners and the English fluent speakers. Same pattern in math, except that here the scores are going up across the board as they did in the state. But the English language brainware group improved by 27 scaled score points, dramatically better than the non-brainware users, and frankly, actually dramatically better even than the English fluent learners. So again, starting to close or narrow that gap between the two. And the last example I want to share with you is an experience from English language learning going on in not an English language environment, but in fact in an environment where Spanish is the predominant language. Again, now we're going to move back up to a more affluent population because this is a private school. All of the families and all of the students are Spanish-speaking, native Spanish speakers, but they're a group of parents and families that are place a lot of importance on learning English as a second language. In this case, it was fourth grade students assigned to either a control or brainware group, and again, using brainware 3 times a week for 12 weeks. Here we're looking at an English language academic achievement test, which is how this school measures their students, and looking at their achievement in reading, writing, and math. And of course, this is administered in English, so the students are really having to show what they're learning in their second non-native language. So what we're seeing here is the median percentile rankings for listening, speaking, and reading. And you can see the green bars are the control group, the blue bars are the brainware group, the lighter bar is the pretest, the darker bar is the post-test. And you can see that there was significantly more improvement for the students who had had cognitive training than for those who hadn't. For both story comprehension and characteristics of the language, which is in characteristics, what they're doing is they're listening to a statement that's read by the examiner, and they respond whether the statement is true or false. So they have to understand the language and then determine whether that is true or false. The reading comprehension, there's a trend there, although we didn't see a significant effect size, but for the others we do see an effect size that is significant. Similar situation in writing and math. Writing context, which is their ability to write a story in response to a picture. And then also in math reasoning, were significant effect sizes. Trends in writing context and in math calculation, although not a measurable or significant effect size, and there's just a trend in those. Nonetheless, seeing even in this difficult situation of students asking to show their cognitive progress and their ability to manage language in executing academic tasks, where we're seeing quite a bit of impact. So we've looked today at this interplay between cognitive skills and language learning. We know from significant research that's been done in the last number of years about the impact of language learning on cognitive skills and the benefits of that. But we're also seeing that cognitive skills can have a bidirectional impact, and that improving cognitive ability, cognitive capacity, and these underlying skills can actually expedite and help with language learning. So that's our presentation for today. Since there's nobody on in this second recording, I can't answer questions, but would be delighted to respond to them if you are listening to this later. I should also note that if you are interested in receiving a certificate of participation, having listened to this webinar, you can simply contact us. My contact information is here. Just send us an email. So if you need a certificate, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to explore any of the information, receive more information on brainware or anything else we've talked about in this webinar, you can feel free to contact us here. Thanks very much for your joining us today. We're delighted that you were able to do that and hope to see you sometime soon at another webinar.